Okay, everybody, let's kick this off. So, my name is Quinn Sandler. I'm going to be your host today. I'm going to introduce, and I'll be with Bobby manning the chat. So, if any questions arise throughout the webinar, definitely put them down there, and we'll make sure at the end that we do some questions and answers. And I'll kind of hop back on at the end of the webinar and help organize that. So as I said, really, thank you for joining. Our speakers today are going to be Matt Jordan and Lauren Friedman. So Matt, a little bit about Matt. Matt's the Director of Sports Science at CSI Calgary, which is one of Canada's Olympic training centers. He's a strength and conditioning coach and an applied sports scientist, and really leads the charge for Plantiga in all things performance and applied sports science. Joining him today is Lauren Friedman. Lauren is our resident biomechanist. Along with being a dual sport NCAA athlete. She's a biomedical engineer. And really the two of them drive a lot of the growth around the insights and the use of the platform. So very, very excited for everybody to be here today and to kind of take part in this webinar. Just kind of lastly, what they'll be going over is really how they use Plantiga in monitoring athletes. They're going to be covering tactical strategies for reviewing the data, literally how they do it, and then going through some use cases as well as some kind of background and context on the platform. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Matt and Lauren. I'm going to turn my camera off. And again, thanks everybody for being here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Quinn. It's great to be here. Really excited just to be sharing some of the work that we're doing with Plantiga. You know, my background is as a sports scientist, strength and conditioning coach, but Quinn approached me now going on just over 5 years ago when we were doing research looking at how to help athletes after ACL injury and using this sort of a dual force plate system to look at interlimb asymmetries. And he said, hey, what do you think about an insole that could do that? And I was absolutely hooked on it, just the idea, because you know, a key part for us is getting out of the lab and into the real world. And so my journey has gone on now for over 5 years with the company, and again, just excited here today to share. So I'll first of all talk a bit about Plantiga, and then I'm going to throw to Lauren, and she's going to go through some of the new features. So you might be thinking of us just as a analytic company that uses an insole, and I often say that the insole is impressive, but it's the least impressive thing that we do. At the end of the day, the insole is just a conduit to connect our movement coaches with other humans. And so you have to envision that this insole, this smart insole that I'm holding here, is really just a way that we can connect with people in the world to help them live a better life. So whether you're an elite athlete or you're a weekend warrior or you're trying to set a new personal best in a marathon, we are taking this insole and we are using our movement coaches to help you drive better insights around your health and performance. The origins of the system is actually in elite sports. So we're talking here elite military, Olympic training centers. That's where I come from. Our work in the NFL, NHL, Major League Baseball, and we've been working over many, many years refining our platform with these individuals in mind. So how do we create a system that's got, you know, sufficient reliability, validity, that is able to provide the types of insights that we need to drive, you know, the pinnacle of human performance. But I think what I'm most proud of as we start to see the company grow is that we are really reaching all sorts of clients. The quote that you see here on the screen is actually one of our clients. This individual works with our movement coaches. He has Parkinson's, and in his world, our capacity to take this insole and connect him to our movement coaches has really transformed how he moves. And so we are broadly focused on wellness, sport performance, military application. But you know, the key thing here is obviously taking our intelligent insole that you see in the center here, connecting up into the cloud, and then having people who move in all kinds of sectors connected to our movement coaches so that we can help them, you know, optimize their health and performance. So as I mentioned, what's in it for me as a practitioner is that this technology lets me get outside of the lab to measure people on the field of play where they matter most. From a practitioner, we're talking about, assessing people before injury, getting a baseline on them. Once injuries have occurred, monitoring them after injury as they return to play, return to sport, return to competition, and looking at their biomechanics in a very granular way. As a person using this, and I use this in my runs frequently, what it allows me to do is really assess my movement over multiple training sessions, multiple running sessions to see how things are changing so I can optimize my own personal health and performance. You may be wondering about, the technologies that are out there. I mean, IMUs are everywhere. They're not actually hard to obtain, these sensors. And they're placed anywhere from the mid back to the hips to the shins. And you may be wondering why an insole. And what we know is that when you take an IMU and you place it in an insole, the data becomes increasingly more accurate by the way that it's affixed underneath a flexible insole and placed inside a shoe. And so this is a key advantage of using the Plantiga system, is that this approach allows us to provide the highest quality data to people who are using it. But here's the challenge. What you see on the screen here is actually real data from the Plantiga insole captured during running. It's just a screen cap of a foot strike. And if you take a look at this data, you see the acceleration in the X, Y, and Z direction. And if you just take a quick look at that signal, it is very, very complex. Now you can imagine going for a 10-kilometer run, you're out, you've been, just think about the massive amount of data that's coming in from an insole that's sampling at 400 times a second, right? This data is very, very, very complex. And where most companies go is they'll use an analytical algorithm. So they'll slice up this crazy signal using a human that looks and says, well, I think this peak might be important here, or maybe it's this rise and acceleration there, or maybe it's this place here that's the most important. And the challenge with that is that this data is just too complex to be able to take that approach. So what Plantiga is doing here, importantly, is using machine learning models to extract the relevant biomechanical parameters that we're going to be showing you here today. So machine learning, in this case, it's the same type of approach that Google would use to distinguish a cat from a lion. So it's a deep learning algorithm. We take in these patterns that we observe and we measure, and then deep learning allows us to extract the biomechanical parameters that you're going to see here today. And that's a huge advancement in the system over the past 5 years, is we started with analytical algorithms, and now we are exclusively using AI to power all of our insights around biomechanics and movement health. So you might be sitting there thinking to yourself, what does this mean? And as a practitioner, yes, when you're looking at athletes' movements, you want to be able to convert this data that comes in from this accelerometer into something useful. And you want to make sure that it's valid, right? That you understand the reliability of the system. And I wanted to let you all know that the AI is unlocking our potential here to drive biomechanical insights. We do extensive internal validation. There's also partner validations that we've been a part of at the Canadian Sport Institute Calgary, where we're using sort of gold standard measures to help understand how this system works. And we have partners like the reference you see here from Dr. Chris Napier at University of British Columbia that are doing third-party validation on the system. So here is the beauty of it. What you're seeing on the screen right now is data obtained from an elite female athlete. This individual has a hip injury, a right side hip injury. And what we're looking at is the stride length asymmetry in this individual as they come back from injury over these 200-meter repeat sprint intervals. And Lauren will actually go into this case study as we move into the next part of the presentation. But what you can see is we've moved beyond simply reporting acceleration at the foot. And because of the AI, because of how we're using machine learning, we're actually able to extract a multitude of biomechanical indices like stride length, ground contact time, limb speed, all sorts of measures that can help practitioners really drive insights. And most importantly, connect our movement coaches with the end user to help them move better to help optimize their health and performance. So with that, hopefully I've sort of teed it up here to give you a sense of where we're heading. I'm going to throw it over to Lauren now, and she's going to walk you through a new feature that we have called the Explore page, which really lets us dive into the data. And we're going to do that by looking at some case studies, 3 case studies actually, that are going to help build some context for how you might want to use this system in the world in which you live. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. Lauren, I'm throwing over to you.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, as the biomechanist and a movement coach at Plantiga, I use this information every day. I sit down with Matt and with other members of the team, and we look at this data and we derive insights from this data. And I just kind of want to share with all of you how we actually interpret all of that stuff. So hold on a second here. Just want to check that I'm sharing the right screen here. Oh, can you guys see the Plantiga page? One second here, sorry. Okay. Sorry, sometimes the Zoom screen share gets a little finicky. Okay, let's try again. Okay, now I think we're looking at the right page. Sorry about that.
We gotcha.
Okay, good. So this is just a first case study that I want to look at with you all. And so this is a run activity. So on the screen, we are looking at the raw data, and this is the accelerations at the foot. So in the top half of the graph here in orange, these are the accelerations on the left foot, and in the bottom half in green are the accelerations on the right foot. And so, you know, the first time you see this, you might be like, what am I actually looking at? So I'm just going to dive into a little bit with you guys here and kind of walk you through step by step what I'm looking at in this data, and what kind of important features you might want to be looking at as well. So the first thing I notice is that there are sort of two sections to this activity. So we've got this first half here, and then we've got a bit of a pause here, and then a second half here. So this activity was a person running and turning around and then running back. But if we actually want to look at the data a little bit more granularly, I'm going to zoom in on some steps here. It's coming. So what you're going to see when this data loads is a very cyclical pattern, as you might expect for running. And so you can see there are some large peaks and some small peaks, and it'll show up when our Wi-Fi gets a little bit better here. There we go. So there's a cyclical nature to this running signal, as you would expect. We know as movement coaches and biomechanists that these large peaks are the foot strikes and these smaller peaks are the toe offs. But just as a human looking at this information, I can't really tell exactly the time when the foot is coming on and off of the ground. And so a big differentiator for our platform is actually using machine learning to help us distinguish those points of contact. So what I'm going to do to basically give us a little bit more information is just use this controls box on the side. And it's highlighting when each foot is off the ground. So this is part of the output of our machine learning algorithm, and it's helping us figure out the different phases of gait, essentially. So if we look at this gray bar, so the gray bars are when the foot is off the ground, and the white is when the foot is on the ground. So this point here would be toe off. So you can see it's within that smaller peak that we identified earlier, but now we have an exact point. And then this point right here is the foot strike, as we knew before, but now we have an actual point for it. So you can see, as you would expect, we've got a toe off and then a foot strike, a toe off, foot strike, and that same thing is reflected on the right side. But what's really interesting also is that in this raw data, you can see the different shapes of the peaks for both sides. So we've got a slightly different pattern for the left toe off compared to the right toe off. And even some of the foot strikes are different. And each step is even a little bit different. So this data is super granular. And there's a wealth of information included in this data. So it might be a little bit overwhelming, but that's where our algorithms come in and they help extract some of the insights and give you some more intuitive metrics that might help you develop the context that you're looking for. So I'm just going to zoom out of this graph by clicking anywhere else on the screen, and I'll turn off the gray bars. So now that you have a bit of context into this data, I'm just curious what you guys see in this data. So I know that's maybe a rhetorical question, but the first thing that I notice is that if I were to draw a line connecting all of these peaks on the left side, it's, you know, there's a bit of waviness happening, but overall it's pretty flat. Whereas when I come over to the right side, there's a huge amount of variability happening here. And that's not entirely surprising because this person actually has a history of right ankle sprain. So we can see the variability on the injured side is significantly higher than on the non-injured side. And that's like a very consistent pattern that we've seen with injured people because variability is highly correlated with neuromuscular control. So even though this individual is, I think, 2 years after his ankle injury, there's still a significant amount of asymmetry happening here. And that's really prominent to see in the raw data, which you might not be able to get if you were just looking at averages over the entire activity. So let's jump into some of the other data views that I mentioned on this Explore page. So up in the top right corner here, I'm going to click Select Plots. And this is going to open a menu for us to essentially select whichever gait parameters we're interested in looking at throughout the activity. So you can see here there's double support and single support and some various metrics that are actually more relevant to walking than for running. So all of this is available for walking, and it's hugely valuable for walking, especially for example, the client who has Parkinson's, where we do a lot of walk training with him. But I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and come to some of the more running specific metrics. So first off, I'll just start with speed so we can go step by step and get context as we go. So here's his speed profile. This is his instantaneous speed throughout the activity. So obviously he started standing still, and then he started running up to between 3.5 and 4 meters per second. And then this would be where he turned around and then started running back. So based off the accelerations up here, we're actually predicting the foot speeds and then predicting the body center of mass speed. And this metric has been validated to within 0.5 to 1% externally validated. So this metric is very, very accurate, and we use this a lot for training and for prescription as well. So let's go into some of the other metrics that we might be interested in. So for this particular person, I'm going to click stride length and vertical takeoff and landing accelerations. And then I'm going to come down and look at these numbers. So again, this person has a history of ankle injury on the right side. So you might be wondering, why do they have a longer stride length on the right side? So consistently throughout the site, right is in green and left is in orange. So in the stride length, there's a stride length asymmetry where this person is taking longer strides on their right side pretty much throughout the activity. So the way that we define stride length is the point of contact of one foot to the next contact. So it's from the right foot strike to the right foot strike. And so the way that I would interpret this discrepancy is basically that the left side is actually being more propulsive. And so because you go from a right foot and then a left foot strike, which then propels more, the right stride length ends up being longer than the left stride length, despite the fact that there's an injury on the right side. Now, when we come down to the takeoff and landing accelerations, we can see that hypothesis is basically supported, because we can see that the left takeoff accelerations are higher than the right takeoff accelerations. So this is toe off, and essentially this person is pushing off of the ground faster on the left side compared to the right side. In the landing, the opposite is happening, where essentially the right side, which is the one with a history of injury, that side is actually hitting the ground faster than the left side. And so this person seems to just have difficulty in absorbing impact on that right side, which would definitely be related to the ankle injury that he has or that he did have. And so this would be a trainable deficit that I'd be working on with this athlete to try and improve his impactability and minimize the asymmetry that we're seeing on the toe-offs, just to improve his running economy in general. So that's our first case study that I just wanted to go through. We're going to go over to another individual here. So the first one was a regular run, and we're going to look at a sprint now. So there are things that are different in this activity, as you would expect. What do you guys see? For me, right off the bat, I can see that these accelerations are higher compared to the previous activity. That pretty much aligns with what I would expect. If you're doing a maximal effort sprint, you're moving faster, so you have to have higher accelerations at your feet to achieve that speed. So the peaks overall are higher, but let's zoom in a little bit and take a more granular approach, just like we did the last time. So again, you can see it's different from the previous time. We still have these smaller-ish peaks and we have some larger peaks, but it's kind of hard to tell. So that's why we're going to use this control box here and highlight when the foot is off the ground. So our machine learning algorithms will do this for you so you don't have to eyeball it, and you can be confident in the metrics that you're using. So this would be a toe off and this would be a foot strike. Again, it's a cyclical pattern. It's interesting that the toe off accelerations are much closer in magnitude to the foot strike accelerations, which was not the case in the previous case study that we just looked at. And really that's just because when you're sprinting, you have to be more propulsive. So you have to get off of the ground faster to achieve your speeds. We can also see the accelerations through the swing phase, which is something that is pretty unique to an IMU based sensor. If you're using a force plate, for example, you only get data when your feet are on the force plate. And you don't really get anything in the swing phase, but because we measure movement and not force, we can get that information and we can see what's happening in the swing phase of gait. So I'm going to zoom out again here and turn off the algorithm. Okay, so just the same as the other case study, I'm going to go to the select plots and I'm going to just start with speed so that we can see how the accelerations actually correspond to the speeds that we're achieving. So like I said, this was a maximal effort sprint. So you can see the instantaneous speed profile throughout this activity. We've got some acceleration here. This athlete achieves a top speed of 8.02 meters per second, or 8.18 meters per second actually. And you can see that in the sidebar on the right there. And then you can see his deceleration profile as well. And you might notice that the speed profile and the outline of the raw actually are somewhat related. And that again makes sense just because as you have to achieve a higher speed, your feet have to be coming on and off the ground faster. Okay, so this is an athlete that we have been monitoring over time, and he has a history of left hamstring injury. So what's really interesting about him is that if we look at his stride length throughout this one activity, he's got different movement patterns for the different components of his sprint. So movement asymmetries and movement patterns in general are very task dependent. If you, for example, wanted to pick up a 500-pound barbell off the ground, there's only really one way that you can achieve that task. You have to bend your knees, you have to bend at the hips, you have to flex your core and stabilize everything before you can pull that off the ground. Whereas if you wanted to pick up a golf ball off the ground, you could do that off 1 foot, off 2 feet, you could bend sideways, you could bend forward, you could do it any number of ways. So the task-specific movement patterns are extremely important, especially when we're looking at maximal effort tasks. So in this particular case, you can see that when he's getting up to his max speed, he's very symmetrical in his stride lengths. And that's probably because that's the only way that he can achieve that speed, is to be symmetrical and have both legs moving and having maximal power output, basically. Once he achieves his speed, though, and he starts to decelerate, that's when his asymmetries become a lot more prominent. And that's where you can see the deficiencies and the asymmetries. And that's really because acceleration and deceleration are completely different movement patterns and completely different neuromuscular, I guess, patterns, to be honest. And so what we're looking at basically is his different movement patterns throughout his different tasks in the sprint. And we can see that when he starts to decelerate and when he needs to absorb the impact, that's when his protective pattern for his left hamstring injury starts to become more prominent. So another data view that's really valuable for this type of application is actually foot speeds. So I'm going to pop over to the foot speed graph. So this is something pretty unique to Plantiga, I think. I don't really know of anybody else who's doing this type of exploration. So the blue line is the speed graph that we saw on the previous screen, but we're also looking at the speeds of the individual feet throughout the swing phase. So the same as throughout the entire site, orange is left and green is right. So you can see again, as this athlete is increasing his speed, there's a slight discrepancy where his left foot is actually moving faster than his right foot. And then once he decelerates, his right foot is actually moving faster than his left foot. And again, we can see the asymmetries in the different tasks throughout his sprint. So because we're monitoring this athlete and we're changing his training patterns over time and we're working with his coach, this is a deficit that we're working on very actively, and we're essentially collecting data weekly to try and minimize these asymmetries and make sure that he's healthy and not going to injure himself again. So those are the two case studies that I really wanted to highlight, a regular run and a sprint, and just to look step by step at the metrics. So we'll kind of get into the Q&A at this point. Matt said there were 3 case studies. It's sort of 2.5. Thanks to Karen for proposing a question ahead of time, because we were actually able to go and find a data set that answered her question. So the first question that I want to address is about sprint intervals and how you can see fatigue in those intervals. So I'm just going to go over to this third case study. So this is an athlete. It was actually the same data set that Matt brought your attention to in the slides at the start. And so what we're looking at here, we've got the athlete walking up to the start line, pausing a little bit, and then this section is the sprint. And then we've got walking after the sprint, and then these are intervals. So we've got 4 sprints, and those would be those higher peak sections and the walking in between. So just to start with the speed profile, you can see, because this is instantaneous speed, you can see the speed is dropping off definitely throughout each of the individual sprints, but also across each of the different intervals, which is absolutely an effect of the fatigue that this athlete was experiencing. So we can see we start at about 6.5 and we go to just below 6 in the first interval. In the second one, we start at 6 and we go a little bit above 5 meters per second. In the third one, we start at 6 and dropped even below 5 meters per second. And in the last one, we're about 5.5, dropping to below 5 again. So just right off the bat, you can see the fatigue is affecting the way that this athlete was able to perform. And now there are some other metrics that I'd like to draw attention to. So I'm just going to zoom in on one of the sprints here. So let's take this one. And I'm going to go down and check out how the ground contact time actually changed throughout this activity. So you can see that at the start of the sprint, the ground contact time was maybe around 140 milliseconds, but throughout the sprint, the ground contact time increased, and that would again probably be a result of the fatigue. And so you can see how that's changing throughout each of the sprints and each of the intervals. So that would be one place to look for fatigue. And if we go down to some of the other metrics, I'm just going to zoom out. So this stride length graph is the one that we saw in the introductory slides. And you can see this athlete has a very prominent stride length asymmetry where the left leg takes longer strides than the right leg. And that's very likely a result of the hip lack of range of motion on the right hip. And so this athlete's just not able to take as long of strides on the right side. And that's very prominent throughout both the walking and the running. And if we go down to the vertical and takeoff acceleration graphs, so this is quite interesting as well. You can see that for takeoff, there's a slight bit of asymmetry, but mostly symmetrical on the whole. And when we go to vertical landings, the right side is actually dropping off compared to the left side for all of the intervals, which is an interesting pattern. And so what we would do with this athlete, actually what we are doing with this athlete, is we're working with their coach and with their physiotherapist to try and address these issues. And it's a process between the coach, the athlete, and the physiotherapist to try and overcome these issues and work towards improving performance on the whole. So I hope that answers the question about fatigue in intervals, and we'll kind of open it up to any other questions that anyone might have.
Thanks, Lauren. That's fantastic. I got a question here from Jeremy. He says, what are your go-to metrics?
Matt, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks. Just going to move my screen down here so I'm not looking up at my second monitor. And sorry, Quinn, who was the name that who asked the question?
Jeremy.
Jeremy. Okay. Well, thanks, Jeremy, for the question. So go-to metrics, it is entirely context dependent. But where we always start is we start with the raw acceleration data. And that's a really important starting point. We use that to make sure that obviously the data was collected properly. We use it as a scan to make sure there's nothing in there that needs to be filtered out. So go-to number one is to look at the raw data. The second thing, as I said, is building context. So if we're trying to look at movement asymmetries, if we're trying to look at some of the stride length asymmetries that Lauren was sharing here today, as we know, walking slow, walking fast, running slow, running fast, jumping, all these asymmetries will depend on the context. So we go to performance second. And so performance, what that allows us to do, for example, the second case study that Lauren showed, it was an elite level sprinter, a high school sprinter running 8 meters per second. That context is very different than the first example, which was somebody running in a clinic environment where you can imagine they're running up a hall, turning around and running back down the hall like you would do in any sort of physiotherapy setting. So the performance data really lets us see context. And that's the second stopping point that we go to. Once we now know context, we are now going to the asymmetries and key asymmetries. So the vertical touchdown and takeoff or propulsive asymmetries are quite informative. Remember as well that all these asymmetries will have their own bandwidths, right? So for example, in jumping, a threshold of about 10% has clinical relevance, meaning that when people are higher than 10% left to right, that would sort of be indicating that there's probably something there that we need to look at. Whereas in something like stride length, if it's more than about 3% based on our normative database, that's a threshold where above which we typically don't see non-injured individuals. So the between limb comparison and asymmetries would be that again that point. And you can imagine we're literally sitting down, we're looking at ground contact time, stride length, we look at limb speed or foot speed, which is seems to be very sensitive around injuries and important for our interpretations. And then the final thing, stopping point in terms of go-to metrics, is that we're using machine learning to essentially identify movement patterns that are associated with injuries. Now, I'm not saying that we're predicting injuries, very, very importantly. What we're predicting is the presence of movement patterns that look like somebody's hurt. So if you do a 2-minute walk test, based on that 2-minute walk test, we can look at the movement pattern. And essentially it's a predictive insight to say, does this person look like they're moving like a healthy person? Or do they look like they're moving like an injured person? And so that would be my 4 layers of go-to metrics. And it's what we're doing every Friday when we sit down to go through these records in sort of order of sequence in each case to arrive at some interpretations around the movement profile.
That's
Hope
awesome.
that answered the question.
Yep, that's awesome. That's very helpful. Couple more questions coming in. One from Calden. There's a lot of good data about the feet, but running is not just about feet. Hip movement, back position, shoulders play a critical role as well. How does Plantiga help with the overall movement of the entire body?
I can maybe start this one off and then Matt, jump in if you've got anything to add. So, I mean, everything's connected in the body. And you can see that with that, in that third case study where that athlete has a hip issue, you can see that presented in the stride length. And so even though we're only technically measuring how the feet are moving, the different issues that are happening up in the kinetic chain actually do get reflected at the feet. And you can get a lot of basically proxy measurements of how things are working together.
Yeah, I mean, Lauren, that's exactly what I would have said as well, is that, you know, the power in measuring at the foot is it is the point of contact that obviously links the kinetic chain. And the second thing is that, and this is really important, we often get the question like, do you measure pressure or do you measure force? And what we measure is movement. And because we're using AI and predictive algorithms, and we're really measuring the movement of the foot and the limb, right? It is allowing us to get beyond just, you know, what is the foot doing, and really understanding the connection point between what the foot's doing and what that means up and down the chain. So for example here, most of our data so far around injury and movement health has been at the knee joint. So we're looking at individuals who've had ACL injury, they do a 2-minute walk test. And we also have people in this demographic with other types of knee injuries. And essentially, we're looking, how do they look early on after, let's say, an ACL reconstruction surgery, a few weeks, and how might they look many years after? So you can imagine we're building this out around the knee. We have a data set that we're building out around the ankle. We're going to be moving up to the hip. We're going to move into the lower back. We're going to move into concussions. So it's a sort of a slow, steady process of using global movement that we're measuring at the end of that kinetic chain, and using predictive algorithms to really draw insights throughout the body.
Awesome. That's great. Thanks. Okay, we have one more question, which we have lots coming in from Prolific Performance. So can we discuss load asymmetries and what that may represent in an athlete? For instance, on the single leg jump test, if an athlete double hops to absorb the force on their left, but sticks their right, does that mean she has bad asymmetry?
I'll just kick it off, Lauren, and then I'll throw it to you. So again, a really key concept, I think, here when we're talking about movement asymmetries is, number one, they are variable, right? So you can't tell, I always look to see, do we have a pattern of asymmetry? And I think that's an important thinking point about how we view these. So if somebody does a one-off jump and they have a bit of a hop, I might go and say, okay, if we repeat the jump 10 times and we do this on a second day, do we see that pattern showing up consistently? If the answer is yes, now we can start to look at a couple of different things. I'm just going to focus on jumping because that was the nature of the question. Number one, it's a limb capacity, right? So when I compare how high I jumped on my right versus how high I jumped on my left, it's a measure of the capacity of the right and the left, the propulsive capacity. When I look at how I land, right, so now how I'm absorbing energy, that is also a capacity. But as Lauren pointed out, the capacity to be propulsive and then to absorb energy are different, because we know that concentric muscle actions and eccentric muscle actions are different things. The final point that I would say is we use a measure called the reactive strength index, and this is becoming increasingly more common, especially in a clinical setting. A good friend of mine, Dr. Enda King from the Sports Surgery Center in Dublin, Ireland, just did, to the best of my knowledge, probably one of the best and largest studies of ACL reconstructed athletes. There were more than 1,400 participants in this study. And what they wanted to do was using biomechanical testing to look at predictors for a future re-injury. So whether that be contralateral or ipsilateral re-injury. It was very interesting that all of the common measures that we typically look at, limb symmetry and quadriceps strength, some of the other more common measures were really not very telling. But one of the things that was actually telling between those two groups is that the group that went on to suffer a re-injury was like a squishy Cadillac, right? Whereas the group that fared well was more like an Audi S4. So you can imagine the suspension in a squishy Cadillac, right? Cushy ride, kind of squishing around the corner, versus an Audi S4 where you've got a very tight suspension. That actually distinguished the athletes who went on to suffer a re-injury. And notably, what they had was reduced stiffness in their system. So that's another metric that we can pull out. And again, going back to asymmetries, is we can look at this reactive strength index, which is a measure of plyometric ability, stiffness. It's also correlated with running economy, meaning the better your reactive strength, the better your running economy. And also, as I mentioned here, an important thing for injury. So a roundabout way to say that when it comes to asymmetries, especially in jumping, you got to break it down according to the different phases. So how you propulsive, how you land, and then measures like RSI. We need to look over multiple movement cycles and probably over a couple of sessions. And then we build a profile. And to your point, it's at that point that you could go in and answer the type of question that you asked about, how do I now interpret that for the individual?
Yeah, if I can actually just add to that, I think there's not really such thing as bad asymmetry. There is asymmetry. And if you, for example, were very symmetrical but symmetrically weak, that's probably not a good thing. But if you're asymmetrically strong, that's better. And you can then have a trainable deficit that you're working to increase your symmetry and then try to be more symmetrical. So there's always a bit of a gray area there.
Great point. And that's actually just another thing from Dr. King's research that was interesting, is that back to limb symmetry, it was interesting that wasn't telling between the group that went on to suffer re-injury and the group that didn't. They were actually both equally as asymmetrical. but the group that fared better were asymmetrically stronger, if that makes sense. So I think that's a really good notion as well. And that's why we always want to look at single leg capacities, right? Because you could have two symmetrically weak limbs versus asymmetrically strong limbs. And I'll just leave it to you for your context to understand whether that would be more desirable or less, depending upon the types of things that the target person is needing to do for their either sport performance or just activities in general.
Okay, that's awesome. Got a couple questions here from Ryan. He appreciates you guys doing this. That's awesome. Have you come across much change in metrics when testing different shoes with distance runners? And then a second one, he says, when you talk about clinically relevant discrepancies, is there a place where you guys have listed what you found so far to be most relevant? Thank you.
Lauren, you want me to kick it off and then go to you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just, can I start with the second part of the question?
Yes.
Which is, yeah, I mean, so in a nutshell, that's going to be our next webinar. So we are collecting this data, and we know that's the question, right? As everyone says, okay, so what is, like, how do you know what these thresholds are? And what we're seeing is that with the Plantiga system, so number one, it's very hard to relate asymmetries that you might measure, let's say with force plates, that's my world in our strength and power lab at the Canadian Sport Institute Calgary, to what I might measure with Plantiga when someone's doing a sprint, right? So the correlation there is probably going to be a bit low. So what I would say is that when it comes to where we say sort of that minimum clinically, or the clinically important threshold, what we're doing is, just so you know, is we're building this out with Plantiga. We are doing it in the context of comparing to other gold standard measures, so we can see sort of how these align between devices. And then we're building out these thresholds for each of our metrics in a very specific way. And that's actually what we plan to do for our next webinars, to provide some more context around that.
I can maybe hop in for the first part of the question about different shoe types. So I haven't explicitly done a lot of long distance running tests with different shoes, but I have done some short distance just to kind of experiment and investigate a little bit. And there definitely are differences between, for example, a very cushiony shoe and a more minimalist shoe. And I also just tried with dress shoes just to see what it was like. And the real difference is that because our sensor is coupled with the foot, it's showing you the accelerations that are happening at the foot. And so if you've got a pillow underneath your foot, there's going to be more absorption between the ground and your foot. And so those accelerations will probably tend to be less as you're running. The caveat to that is that you also might be changing your running strategy as you use different shoes. So lots of people run differently with minimalist shoes than with shoes with a big cushion in the heel. And so it depends on which metrics you're looking at, but I have noticed changes with different shoes.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. We do have, I mentioned to you before, with sort of the crux of the value proposition here is, this is just a connection point between our movement coaches and the end user, right? So this is very useful if you're a practitioner. I'm a practitioner. I find this incredibly useful on my day-to-day. But really, at the end of the day, what we're doing is we're taking movement coaches and using this to connect them to an end user. And so individuals that we have in our program today are relatively high-level triathletes, runners, and part of what we've been doing with some of these individuals is actually they will tag in and say, hey, I'm heading out for a run with this type of shoe, and then on my next run, I'm using this type of shoe. So now we can take our movement coaches, and context is everything. We're trying to answer the questions that matter for that person, right? So when we sit down, we can actually compare records between different shoe types to see what sort of data we pull from that person. And obviously, because they can do this now out in the real world, it's not in a treadmill or in a store. They can go out and run on the trails, or GPS is not a limiting factor because there's no GPS in this, right? It's just storing information. So you can be anywhere you want, and we can collect that biomechanical data and break it down and make those comparisons at a pretty granular level.
Awesome, thank you. I got a question here from Garrison. What additions to the hardware, or are there other supporting products, do you feel is next in enhancing your ability to assess an athlete's ability to perform efficiently?
I think this might also be one where Quinn might jump in. So I mean, it is called the product roadmap for a reason. You know, you would think it'd be so easy, right? You just buy this sensor and stick it under a shoe, and away you go, and you measure stuff. You'll measure stuff, but this thing might not be time synchronized. You might lose data. You might not have a high enough sampling frequency. You get this crazy complex signal. You don't know what to do with it. All of these things are sort of part of the product roadmap. So where the investment has come up to this point is moving from, you know, 5 years ago, which was analytical algorithms, which are really, really tricky, to today where we have robust AI that's powering everything that we do. But the next step is obviously making this as comfortable and form-fitting as possible. So one thing is partnering with orthotics companies so that if you have a custom orthotic, for example, that you prefer to wear, that you could just take the sensor and it could lock into a cavity inside that orthotic. That's key. Number two is, you know, making this as thin as possible. And at our last development of this pod, the notion there at that time was that we could probably decrease this by at least 50% in terms of its thickness. Now it's already pretty thin. When I run, I actually don't feel anything underneath my foot. I have no issue at all. I don't profess to be an elite level track and field athlete. I'm just a guy who likes to try and stay healthy and fit. But I don't feel anything. But obviously making this sensor thinner will be massive for individuals who are wanting to put this into high performance footwear. The other thing too is battery life. So right now we can capture 5 hours worth of data on this a pod, and it's importantly not a lithium ion battery. Now, you know, you may think, well, why would you care about that? Well, I mean, some issues in the past, you might think about Samsung phones that were exploding. We were very cognizant of the fact that, you know, we do not want to put a battery in here that could actually be, let's say, in somebody's boot in the military, and this thing catches fire underneath their foot. So it's actually what's called a super cap battery. So it charges very, very quickly. So we're talking a matter of, 20 minutes or so, and it's fully charged. And then it gives you 5 hours of data collection. But our goal is to actually be able to extend this so you have 24 hours worth of battery life to be able to collect information for long periods of time without having to charge. Right now, you can imagine it's like you got to take this off, you dock it, easy process. We've got a cloud adapter which sends data up to the cloud, and Plantiga can actually look at what's coming in. But in a perfect world, you wouldn't have to take this out and plop it on. You'd have a mat or something that would be able to take that data and automatically do that. That's in the pipeline as well. I mean, Quinn, what else do we got? Any other?
That's what I would say. I would say that we're not, specifically trying to put a sensor somewhere else on the body. We also, the sampling rate and the amount of data that we collect, we're very confident that we're going to be able to get even more insights moving up the actual body, even looking at the back and what's going on at the hip. It's impressive. And I'm not the one that does it, but when we actually start kind of looking at that signal, what we feel confident we'll be able to kind of shed some light on is good. I have another question actually from Umair. Umair is asking, does the surface make a difference? So that means like the ground. So if someone is running on a track or on grass or on a rocky surface, does the metric change or does the raw data change?
A ton.
Yeah.
A ton. Yeah, a ton. And that's a major reason why. And sometimes I'm putting my academic hat on here as an individual who's engaged in research. We sometimes call this ecological validity, right? So, if I take a human, and you might want to look up something called the Hawthorne Effect, right? It's a well-known idea that, just by the simple act of observing somebody, you change their behavior. And what we know is that all of those things are going to impact what you measure. So, if you're in my world of ACL return to sport, if I tell a person with an ACL injury that they need to jump within 5% of each limb in a single leg jump test, that changes what they do, right? That changes my relationship with them. So everything we do is going to change how and what we measure. And nothing could be more true than where we measure this. So whether you're on a mondo track, whether you're on a field, whether you're on a trail, on rocks, on a treadmill, all of this stuff will be drastically different in terms of what we will see. Now, what that means is, right, the biomechanics of it is the same, right? Because what we're using are these algorithms to predict to make predictions. And we've collected, I think we're, as I said, maybe over 50,000 records, all kinds of different environments, people walking with rucksacks and out on hikes and everything you can imagine, because that's actually how machine learning learns the best, is you have to show it. It's like Quinn often says, it's like a toddler learning to walk. You need to expose algorithms to lots and lots of variation so that they don't get biased. But what I think maybe the take home message is for people on the call is that it absolutely changes everything. And so context is everything. And that's why when we sit down and we're breaking this down, the context is really what makes this powerful. So the fact that you measure something in a clinic, when somebody's walking on a treadmill and you're saying, well, I wonder how that's going to relate to when they're on a wet field sprinting or whatever, there are differences there. And that's why we need to get outside of the lab.
It also shows you that running on cement produces a lot of peaks and that it is not necessarily the best for the body. You take the same run with the same shoes and the same person, and you go from cement to a trail. It's just, especially when you're looking at those peak accelerations, it's just always fascinating to see.
Actually, one of our team members at Plantiga was directly looking at that, and he created a machine learning algorithm that was able to distinguish when somebody was walking on grass, concrete, or sand. So it's distinguishable by machine learning algorithms as well, which means that there are changes in the data, definitely.
Yeah, and just to give you another example is that we're I don't want to give too much away, but we have a really exciting prospect with a few different military groups. And one of the things that you can imagine with military population is they got to walk around with, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 kilos on their back. And they've got to do, you're carrying a weapon and bags and helmet and bulletproof vest and all this stuff. And you've got to go march around in all of these crazy environments. And you can imagine that if you're interested in understanding movement patterns and you want to know, what potentially is there underlying that might predispose somebody to an injury, it's really hard to come in and bring them into an environment in a clinic where you watch them walk up and down a hallway and you kind of eyeball it and look what's going on, and then make a prediction about what that might mean when they go out to this environment with 15, 20 kilos on their back and they got to go do this over 6 or 7 hours, right? So what this algorithm is, and building off what Lauren said, where they've already been able to distinguish those different conditions of where you're walking on grass or other surfaces, is we can actually also make predictions around load carriage. So essentially, I can be walking with a 20-kilo pack on my shoulders, and we can make predictions about the quality of my movement based on, do I look like I'm carrying 20 kilos or actually look like I'm carrying 60 kilos, illustrative language. But that's another example where movement is very, very contextually, it's very specific.
Totally, that's awesome. I got a question here from Ian. So sometimes asymmetries indicate something to improve. Other times they indicate a pre-existing condition that will always be present for an athlete. How do you tell the difference?
Well, I mean, the number one thing is this is sort of what we approach all of our movement analysis with is curiosity, right? So first and foremost is we can't, you can't pigeonhole the thinking that this is good or bad. You've got to, I would say it's like coming in like Sherlock Holmes, right? So it's like, okay, Sherlock Holmes just didn't show up to the scene of the crime when he wanted to know who killed the butcher and just picks out his DNA kit and takes DNA. He's got also a fingerprint kit, and he's maybe looking at clues, and he's looking for hair, and he's going to go talk to witnesses, and he's going to formulate. It's Bayesian thinking, right? You're going to go from observations to a hypothesis about what you think might be happening. And so the number one thing that we will anchor to in terms of context, back to this question is, so number one, do we have 2 strong limbs, or do we have 2 weak limbs, right? And are we asymmetrically strong, asymmetrically weak, or just symmetrically weak, or symmetrically strong, right? So that's one important question. Second thing is context. Are you walking? Are you running? Are you sprinting? Are you jumping? How does this pertain to the environment that you're in for performance? The reason that I say that is that although the literature on this is somewhat mixed, there is some indication that a symmetrically strong athlete will have better movement economy and better performance than an asymmetrically weak athlete. So you have 2 strong limbs that you're operating off of. So performance would be another piece of that puzzle, and sort of appraising whether an asymmetry is good or bad. The other thing is his injury history, right? So are we, and who are we dealing with? Like maybe it's somebody who's got an anatomical leg length discrepancy, or maybe it's an amputee, or maybe it's somebody that, there are things here that underlie who they are that are not modifiable, or that, will be difficult to change. And that's another key piece about this, is we really do try to take an N equal 1 approach to looking at the data. So what's the context? What's the injury history? Is it causing pain? Right? Is it associated with pain and other things that would suggest that we need to sort of do something about it? And the final piece of the puzzle, and Lauren touched on this in the final example case study, is that the real power of this is unlocking the potential with an integrated team approach. So if you have a personal trainer, you've got a physiotherapist or a chiropractor or somebody that you're working with, your physician, your orthopedic surgeon, and you're working through challenges, now we can ask the question is, are these asymmetries modifiable? Can we change them through training and exercise? And a couple of examples here is, an individual that we're working with in the beta program. This individual is a master's level triathlete, but a pretty high level triathlete, competed in Kona and some other big Ironman events. This individual has been training and doing kind of just fine, right? Nothing really problematic. We put them through sort of routine monitoring over time, and we start to identify that there are some asymmetries there that we believe to be problematic. They're above clinical threshold. So we're seeing, whereas I was saying, like, normally for some of our measures, they might be 3 to 5%, others are 10. We're seeing asymmetries in jumping of 18, 19, 20%, asymmetries in running of 10, 12%, which are high relative to our normative database. So we're asking the question, yes, they're above the norms. We have some issues here. We follow up on that, and we can actually see that there is considerable left ankle limitation in terms of range of motion. We're able to intervene with that through training. So working with this person's strength and conditioning coach, we're able to work with that person to help devise a specific training program. And after doing all this, we've been able to reduce those movement asymmetries and limb asymmetries back down to our sort of more typical levels that we see in our non-injured population. And so that's the final piece, is what you're seeing modifiable through training? And if it is, that might be an indication to us that sort of having two symmetrically strong limbs, right, can help us with sort of our movement economy and our overall performance. Long-winded answer, but that's kind of how we're working with it.
No, it was good. That was good. I got one more question, and we should probably think about wrapping it up here soon. I have a question from Jelima. So great talk so far. Thank you. One quick question. Have you ever tried using Plantiga in skiing?
We have, actually. We don't have a specific skiing activity, but it's been actually quite interesting to look at the load asymmetry and the load values while skiing. And I think, Matt, you've worked more directly with skiers, but we do have some of that data, and it's very interesting to look at. It's not the typical cyclical nature of walking and running that we looked at in those case studies, but there's a lot of information that you can get from putting the insoles in skis. So maybe I'll hand it off to Matt.
Yeah, unfortunately, I really wish I had an answer here specifically, because we kind of got sidelined by COVID, unfortunately, where I did have some plans with skiers who were coming back after injury to put these in the boots and to actually measure this on snow for individuals who had histories of ACL injuries and were getting back. Certainly in other avenues, and if you look at the published literature, wearable technology and IMUs are being used a lot in skiing and snowboarding to look at movement on snow. And I think that that's a massively important thing to do. I'm just really sad to say I don't have any data to share. I wish I did, I should, but that hopefully will be something that we'll be working on over the next bit. Hopefully
this winter. I got a question here from Barry. Hello, Barry from New Zealand. Barry, have you ever investigated landing acceleration in court field sports and found differences between them and straight line sprinting?
I can start it off. In terms of landing accelerations, do you mean, Barry, like in, for example, a basketball game, looking at the loads in landing, or in general jump tests? Like, are you looking at movement patterns and comparing them between different sports? Is that sort of the question, just to clarify?
I'm going to ask.
Okay.
Change of direction is what Barry said.
Okay. So different sports do have different movement patterns. I've looked a little bit at straight line running and the movement patterns that team sport athletes use and that sprinters use, and they do actually have movement patterns. It was quite prominent in the foot speed signals, actually, where the team sport athletes had like a differently shaped signal than the individual sport athletes. And the different running styles are probably because of the different movements that are associated with the sport. And so if you're in a more change of direction based sport, you tend to have a lower center of gravity to be able to make those changes quickly. And so that would probably contribute to different movement patterns in even just linear running.
Also too, like that might be a good point. We're working on, as one of the tests that we have on the platform is a 5-10-5. So being able to not just look at the time of it, but like step by step, all of the metrics that Lauren went over in the Explore page, imagine that in a 5-10-5.
Yeah.
To be mindful of time, it is 1:03. We've gone about an hour. If there are other questions that are coming that seem a little bit larger to answer, and what I'll do is I will make sure that we answer those. Matt and Lauren, is there anything else from you that you would like to say before we wrap up?
I mean, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us here today. This has been recorded. I know there's probably a lot of information to go through. So, you know, hopefully we'll be able to post that for you guys so you can rewatch. You know, please reach out if you have other, you know, you may want clarification. Something may come to you tomorrow, next week. Reach out to us. And just so you know, like Lauren and I are two humans in Plantiga that are using this data all the time, and we really are here to help. And we're you know, we're happy to help you sort of like triage and figure out how you might be able to apply the technology, and obviously connect you to what we're learning every single week. So it's a lot of fun. It's a very exciting time in using this technology, and I'm just looking forward to building some personal relationships with people who've joined us here today.
I would agree. And again, we've had people join us from all over the world today. So thank you. I know some people it's late, some people it's early. For us, it's in the afternoon. So thanks to everybody. We appreciate it. And we're going to be running these on a regular basis. So kind of stay tuned for the next one. And as Matt said, we'll be going over some of those ranges that we've had. So with that, I wanted to thank everybody. Well, once again, I hope everybody's a great weekend. Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Matt.
Appreciate it.
Yep.
Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.